everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. We are going to have a really fun talk. So the Winchester Historical Society is so happy to be able to offer these online programs. And tonight, our program is we're going to be talking about Edward Brackett's bust that he created of John Brown. I would like to introduce our first speaker, who is Dr. Ellen Knight. She is a specialist in the history of the arts of Boston area around the turn of the century and of the history of Winchester. She has authored several hundred diverse articles on Winchester history, many including, in fact, two on Edward Brackett, who we'll hear about tonight, and it's all available on Winchester's History Online. Tonight, she is going to introduce our guest speaker from Tufts University. After first telling us how Winchester's Edward Brackett came to do the bust of John Brown. Now, I'm going to stop sharing for a moment, and so we can focus on Ellen. Go right ahead.
In 1857, the sculptor Edward Brackett, who lived in Winchester and had a studio in the city, was walking along a street in Boston when he caught sight of a man who instantly arrested his attention, due, he later said, to the dignity of his mien. He turned and walked back to get another look. On asking who the man was, he learned that it was John Brown, the abolitionist. By 1857, Brackett had been making busts of prominent people for almost 20 years and conceived the idea of doing a bust of Brown. After the failed raid on Harper's Ferry and Brown's arrest in October 1859, Brackett was seized with a desire to do it. "I could hardly sleep or eat," he said. "So absorbing was the desire that took possession of my mind." He could not afford the trip to Virginia, and so turned to Brown's friends in Boston, men known as the Secret Six, who had given Brown funds for his cause of initiating an armed slave rebellion and the raid on the arsenal at Harper's Ferry. One of them, George Stearns, discussed it with his wife, who provided the money for the journey. So off the 41-year-old Brackett went on a perilous adventure. Northerners were not wanted anywhere near the imprisoned John Brown. In Harper's Ferry, he said, "I went to the hotel. I walked up to the register and signed myself E.A. Brackett, Boston. And at that time and place, a man might quite as well have booked from hell." In Charlestown, the courthouse and jail were guarded by cannon and troops. Brackett was eyed with great suspicion. A report from the American Anti-Slavery Society noted a sculptor who had come from Boston to obtain a likeness of Brown was deemed, if not himself a dangerous man, to be about a dangerous business. Brackett's mission was no secret, and there was immense opposition to it. But though he was a Republican and an abolitionist, his motives were strictly artistic. He related that "I made no secret of my view when asked, yet took care to define that it was business, pure and simple, not my views, that brought me." But he had difficulty getting access to Brown. He had letters of introduction to United States Senator James Mason, who was attending the trial, and to Andrew Hunter, the prosecuting attorney. Although both were civil, they did nothing, leading Brackett to conclude that they intended to defeat his purpose through procrastination. So Brackett employed some subterfuge. Although the jailer would not allow Brackett to visit Brown without express official permission, the under-jailer would. So on a day when the jailer had to conduct another prisoner to the courthouse, Brackett, with Brown's attorney Hiram Griswold, went to the jail. To ease the under-jailer's fears, Brackett stayed on the threshold so he could swear, if need be, that he had never entered the prisoner's cell. It was Griswold who entered the cell with Brackett's instruments and sketch of a head. At first, Brown was not interested, But on being told it was the wish of his friends in Boston, he consented to Griswold's taking the measurements under the sculptor's instruction. Once that was finished, Brackett headed home, making a stop in New York City, specifically to the offices of the New York Tribune, to deliver to Horace Greeley some articles he smuggled out of Virginia on behalf of an undercover reporter. Brackett finished the clay model of the bust at the end of 1859. Mrs. Stearns wrote, "It was so unexpectedly satisfactory that I gave the happy sculptor an order for one in marble." The Stearnses ordered several other copies. A copy in bronze was sent in 1860 to the President of Haiti, which had held a state funeral for Brown. It was put on display in the presidential palace, crowned with a laurel wreath. In Boston, the bust was exhibited at an artist's reception at Faneuil Hall, at the Anti-Slavery Office, and at the Boston Athenaeum. The bust's image was displayed on numerous cabinet cards that were shared among pro-abolition circles. Although the marble bust had been displayed before the Emancipation Proclamation was issued, when that happened, on January 1st, 1863, the Stearnses held an unveiling at their home to commemorate the proclamation and to honor Brown. About 50 people were invited. Abolitionist Wendell Phillips gave a short speech. Ralph Waldo Emerson read his Boston hymn. Franklin Benjamin Sanborn, also a member of the Secret Six, brought his sonnets on John Brown, read aloud by Phillips. Julia Ward Howe recited her battle hymn of the Republic. Other guests included William Lloyd Garrison, Bronson Alcott, and the sculptor himself. Phillips was given the honor of unveiling the bust by removing the covering of blue cloth spangled with silver stars. The bust stood on the landing of Mary Stearns' staircase in her Medford home for the duration of her life. Mrs. Stearns also sent a plaster cast to Wendell Phillips. On May 28, 1863, when Colonel Robert Gould Shaw led the African-American enlisted men of the 54th Massachusetts Infantry Regiment in a parade through Boston, William Lloyd Garrison was seen on the balcony of Phillips' home with his hand upon the bust as the regiment marched by. Clearly, it had become an icon for the abolitionist movement. Like John Brown himself, Brackett's statue evoked differing reactions. Several pronounced it a faithful representation, including George Henry Hoyt, Brown's first lawyer, who said the bust was a true reflection, admirably displaying his lofty brow, invincible eye, and determined lip. Some found it inspiring. Harriet Tubman was reportedly thrown into an ecstasy of sorrow and admiration. Senator Charles Sumner exclaimed upon seeing it, "There is nothing the sun shines upon so like Michelangelo's Moses." But journalist James Redpath, who saw the bust in both Boston and Haiti, commented that it might well be Moses, but certainly was not John Brown. He objected particularly to the calmness and repose. But then Mrs. Brown, who reportedly came upon it unawares at the Athenaeum, broke into tears. She recognized the face. She said he didn't always look like that, but he could look like that. Brackett himself said, "The bust as you see it is a little poetized. In this case, the idealization is elusive, not to be located in any one feature, but it exists, and purposely, the more truthfully to express the character of the subject. Yet John Brown was not himself a great man, but rather a forerunner of great things." Whatever anyone else thought, Mrs. Stearns was thrilled with it. She sent copies to Booker T. Washington, Victor Hugo, and several others, including the Kansas State Historical Society, which lent it to the 1893 World Columbian Exposition in Chicago. As to the marble copy she commissioned, after her death, that passed to Tufts University, where it lost its identity, leading to a 21st century adventure of rediscovery. For that story, let me introduce tonight's main speaker, Laura McDonald, since 2007, has been the art collection registrar at Tufts University in Medford, where she oversees a collection spread across 3 campuses and cited in over 50 buildings. One of the items owned by Tufts used to be a mystery. Laura's solution of the mystery was featured a few years ago by local media and the New York Times. But we have her with us now to tell the story.
I was just saying to no one here in my room that every introduction should be so gracious, and I appreciate it. And I'm happy to be here. And this is such an exciting story for me. And I'm a little bit nervous, but feel free to ask questions at the end if I skip anything. As Ellen said, this is a huge story, and this is kind of the first time that I've ever done the story starting halfway through, because usually I start at the beginning and have to do all of the information that Ellen just ran through. So this has been kind of an interesting exercise in focusing in sort of on the part of the history of this bust in the care of Tufts University and how that evolved. And so I'd like to share my screen with you and show some pictures. As Ellen said, the bust was commissioned by the Stearnses. And I wanted to start with this picture. I think that it's interesting in the context of this story because it sort of shows how this history and this story is all around us. This is a painting that's in the permanent collection at Tufts, and it shows the house of Lydia Maria Child, who was a wonderful abolitionist. She was an early abolitionist from the 1830s. She started writing as a journalist and as a novelist. Her views on what she regarded as male dominance and white supremacy. So she was way ahead of the curve. And her house is situated here along the river by where you can see the shipworks. George Stearns was a shipbuilder. So her house is here in the foreground. It's this yellow and white house. Tufts purchased it about 30 years ago. And up on the hill, you can see Ballou Hall, which is the first building that was built at Tufts. And this painting is from about 1865. So what's interesting about this is not just that the landscape sort of brewed this story, but the people also. And Lydia Maria Child was the aunt of a young woman named Mary Preston Stearns. And Mary Preston Stearns obviously married George Stearns, and the two of them sort of joined forces as a couple who was dedicated to the abolitionist movement. They were ardently invested in this, and their house was a stop on the Underground Railroad, and they harbored anyone who needed to have safe haven. They harbored them in their home, sometimes living under the floorboards for weeks at a time. So the house here no longer belongs to Tufts, but it did for about 20 or 30 years. And I'm going to move on to my next slide here. So, sorry, I'm going to have to get used to clicking through the PowerPoint. So this is my first introduction to this work of art. The bust of John Brown was physically in deep storage in a place that was at an offsite fine art storage facility. And its name had been separated from the bust. And so we did not know that it was John Brown. I knew that we had a few marble busts, but I did not know who they were. So colleges are unlike museums in the way that their primary function is to serve as an educational institution. So they are often not quite as up on collections management standards as other museums are. And so in the beginning of a lot of local universities, it was often the facilities department, the buildings and grounds department that took care of art in the collection. So about 4 years ago or so, I had a student who was scanning and filing for me all of the files that were in the building and grounds folder in the archives at the university. And I had assigned her this task of going through the folders and then figuring out which object matched with which piece of paper. And at the end, she handed me a pile that she just simply didn't know what they went to. And this was one of them, this piece of paper. And it is the president of Tufts, Leonard Carmichael. And it is to someone named George Sands. And he's inquiring as to whether or not a concrete nose could be made for their John Brown bust by Edward Brackett. So I read this and thought, we don't have a John Brown bust, and Edward Brackett is not in my database of names of artists. And it sort of sat with me for a while. And then I kept coming back to it. And the more I started thinking about it, the more I started thinking, but we do have a bust that has no nose. And I have seen that in the storage facility. So I dug a little bit deeper. I kept going into the files that I had there, the stack that this student had found. She also found this piece of paper saying that she thinks that they thought that the John Brown bust may have been stolen in 1952. So I was sort of thinking, well, it probably was stolen in 1952, and it's probably not that bust that's over in storage. So found another piece of paper that said basically there was a couple of busts. They were, in a storage facility or the storage room in Ballou Hall, the building that you had just seen on the hill, and that they had gone into storage. And I thought, well, maybe. So I got online and I Googled, of course, Edward Brackett's bust by John Brown. And the first hit that I got was this cabinet card from the New York Public Library. And I looked at it and I thought, maybe that is the piece that is over in the storage facility. Now, when I say that's in the storage facility, it was on a pallet with another bust, wrapped in bubble wrap and plastic, and then strapped to the pallet, because these pallets, these two busts, weigh about 200 or 240 pounds each. So this pallet is moved with a forklift. So having the straps on it made it so they couldn't move, but that it was enough that when I was doing inventory, I could go and sort of pull back the sheets, make sure that it was there. So as soon as I found this, I thought, that bust definitely had a beard. So I found another card. And at that point, I talked to my assistant and I said, we're going to go over and look at this. So, this was the first thing that I saw. First of all, art storage facilities are sort of subdivided in ways that make it so that you can store as many pieces of art in one tight area as possible. So in many cases, objects are on high shelves that are like warehouse shelving. So the pallet had landed at a height of about 8 feet. And there was another shelf about 4 feet above it. So in order to get up there, I had to climb up under all, get into all the boxes and pull back all the sheets. So this was the first thing I saw. And I thought, that doesn't look like it. And I also noticed that somebody had drawn eyeballs on him with pen. So I went to the next one. This is my assistant looking up at me and laughing because I was trying to tell him that I believed that we had a bust of John Brown. And he emphatically did not believe with me at the time. Here's another one of George Stearns. And then I found this. So this is John Brown as he was the day that I climbed up there and pulled back the plastic. And of course I had my phone with me so that I could keep going back and forth looking at all the pictures. And I thought, wow, that's really it. This is who this is. I couldn't lift it. I couldn't stand it up. I couldn't look behind it. It's too heavy to move. But as soon as I saw it, I knew that we had something singular and wonderful and exciting, and it was in terrible condition. So I hopped down and went back to the gallery and talked to the gallery director and said, my gosh, I believe we have this wonderful thing in our collection. And, can I hire a conservator to come over and have a look at it, because it's missing its nose and it's in terrible condition. But I showed her the cabinet cards, and of course she gave her blessing that I could proceed. So I went back and I hired the warehouse crew to bring it down. Here's another picture of him that day. I put a piece of cardboard up so that you could see that, in fact, he has no nose. So as soon as I had permission to contact the conservator and to kind of use a little bit of our meager funds to move it and have the warehouse crew bring it down, I went and I started sort of studying what this thing was and where it came from and how we got it and why is it over in Artex bundled up like that. And so, of course, the first thing that I found was George Stearns. And, it's sort of like seeing someone who's in plain sight. It's a little bit like the picture of the Lydia Maria Child House with Tufts in the background. That was, that George Stearns is in fact in a lot of places. This is a rock on campus near the gym that marks the site of the estate, the Stearns estate, which was known as the Evergreens. And as I had said earlier, it was a way station on the Underground Railroad. And this sort of is one of those things that I feel like I walk by and just simply never opened my eyes and looked at it and understood it and thought about it. So the building had been torn down in the 30s. And now what is on that property is a gigantic gym, and there is a new building going up right next door. This is a picture of the house as it looked in the mid-1930s. It was part of Tufts still at that time. It had transferred to Tufts in 1902 when Mary Stearns's will was executed. She died in 1901. And she had left the house and some of her furnishings and 2 busts to Tufts. So this is what the house looked like. And we also have this beautiful painting, a reproduction of which hangs on the wall in my office right now. So it's kind of neat though, because it shows a little bit of the landscape and kind of gives you an idea of how this whole strange sort of story came to be. So the Stearns estate, the Evergreens, you see right here on the lower right, and they had this apple orchard, and they have the train here, which runs through sort of the middle of the painting. And up here in the back, you see Tufts on the hill. And it's kind of interesting to see this, knowing that, it sort of makes sense of the stories about John Brown coming to the house. It makes sense of, the apple orchards and when John or George Stearns was helping runaway slaves, what he often did was he would keep them in the house. And then there were rumors that there were underground, physical underground tunnels that led to the train tracks, and that he would basically finance these people to take the train up to Montreal and sort of help them get established in some business up there. After the raid on Harper's Ferry, George Stearns actually went and got on the train himself because he knew that he would be implicated in the plot now that John Brown had been captured. So it's kind of interesting for me to see this like this. One of the other interesting things about it, we had it conserved a few years ago, is that when we took the backing off of it, we found all of these wonderful maps on the back that actually show where the lead pipes are under the house. Now, those of you who don't know George Stearns was a man who worked in the lead pipe business, and he was kind of on the leading edge of lead pipes and sort of the engineering and understanding of what was good and bad about them. So even during George Stearns's lifetime, George knew that you had to run the water for 5 or 10 seconds before you could drink the water because it collected the lead. So this is an interesting, this was an interesting find on the back of the painting. We were all sort of fascinated by it. So then, of course, our travels took us to Winchester Historical Society, where, of course, I met Ellen. And Ellen has always been sort of the perfect counterpart because she has such a depth of knowledge of Winchester history and of Edward Brackett. And, you know, she was able to pull out these files for us. And we sat there and just marveled at the fact that we had actually found this thing. We found in the files all these wonderful recollections, you know, in the paper and little clippings. And of course, we found these pictures that, as Ellen mentioned, were either used as references or show the bust. So we had a little bit of money to spend at getting it fixed up. And so we hired a wonderful conservator, Rika Smith McNally, who's over here on the right. And you'll also see in here my former graduate assistant, Christian, and my wonderful colleague, Liz Cantor. And the day that we had this pulled down off of the high shelf with the forklift and set up by the workers at the warehouse so that we could actually see what it looked like. And so these are the photos from that day. He's a little woe begone here. So he's missing his nose. He's also missing a pedestal. He would have been on a turned pedestal. We've never located that, but it's the kind of thing that is often separated from the bust. There's a pin that holds it in. So it was definitely something that probably was lost along the way. This is a good shot that we took to sort of show exactly how badly damaged the face looked. And here he is. So the story that we realized and sort of pieced together was that John Brown had been on view in the Stearns' house. And when ownership of the house passed to Tufts, they stayed there. John Brown stayed, the bust of John Brown stayed there. And over time, it was there for 15, 20 years, but then they decided to use the house in a different way. And they wanted to use that whole area, where is now the gym, to be veterans housing after the wars. And so the bust of John Brown was taken out and it was put into the Eaton Library on campus, which was the first library on campus. And from there, it seems to have traveled up to Ballou Hall. Ballou Hall is the building that you had seen on the hill at the beginning. And that's the earliest building on campus. And it seems that John Brown was put into a crawl space between the second and third floors, pushed up against a drain pipe. So you can see evidence of that in a variety of places. he does have some wear and tear. And Rika, the conservator, was able to basically tell us that at some point the bust had fallen. What we were kind of wondering was whether it had been a deliberate act. Someone had cut off his nose the way sort of, happens in cultures that are being overrun by other cultures, that sometimes there's sort of that kind of damage that is explicitly and, deliberately done to works of art. But Rika believes that this actually tumbled and that you can see the damage to the bust in a variety of places that make it apparent that it sort of hit the ground and rolled. So there's damage on the fronts, damage on the back, the nose. And you can see the rust stain on his chest where he was pushed under the drain pipe. So there was a long way to go to get him back into good shape. And so, of course, we also started to look at his friend, George Stearns. Now, at the time, it didn't seem quite so fascinating to me that these two men who had been so bound together in history were also, in fact, physically bound together on a pallet for 50 years in Artex. So this is George Stearns's bust, also commissioned by Mary Stearns. Also has had some wear and tear. As I mentioned, somebody kindly drew some eyeballs into his face with a ballpoint pen. So they are, they're kind of an interesting pair. I find it kind of funny. Here's John Brown after the cleaning had taken place. The busts were both taken out to the facility where the conservator Rika McNally works. And at that time, we sort of had managed expectations about how much of the stains that she would be able to remove. But we were thrilled when this was the result. And here you'll see George Stearns. George was completely intact. He didn't have any parts missing or any damage. He was just filthy. So we had a lot of conversations about how to proceed. We talked about whether or not we should put the nose back on him and whether or not this piece of art would stand alone in such a damaged condition. Obviously there's wonderful classical antiquities out there that are missing important sections of their bodies. And we had a staff meeting where we all sort of talked about whether or not we thought we should proceed with a repair or if we should leave it the way it was. And ultimately we decided that it looked so damaged and it was so distracted from the work of art that we made the decision that we should look into the idea of repairing it. And at that point, we looked internally because we're a university, so we do that. And the first person I called was a woman named Suhey Rodriguez, who works at the Tufts School of Dental Medicine, because I had recently read a very interesting article about her and her work making prosthetic noses for children in South America. And I thought, that's kind of interesting. And I called her and I went and I had a meeting with her and we talked about how this could be done. Could she do the 3D scanning and then mold a nose? And we decided that it could be done. And she was really interested and engaged in the project. But she ultimately didn't have time, and it was hard to pull her away from her more important work of making prosthetic noses for young children in South America. So we hired 3D printsmith in the form of Sean O'Reilly, the guy who's in the red shirt here. And we talked to him about this problem. And we basically said, we know that there were copies that were made, as Ellen mentioned. And so it's not like we'd be wondering what the nose looked like. We knew what the nose looked like. We just didn't have one. So we sent a letter to the Boston Athenaeum, and we asked them if they would loan us their bust of John Brown for a period of 3 days, and that we would do a 3D scanning of both busts and basically figure out what's the missing parts. And so having Sean O'Reilly on site for a few days scanning was fascinating. I stood over him and took pictures, sort of just marveling in the technology and the use of technology, that we don't have to wonder what this bust's nose look like. We know, and we can make one that will fit it perfectly. So that's what we did. So I threw in a couple of pictures just so that you could see what the process looked like. It took Sean probably an entire day just to set up all of the cameras so that everything would be set up and sort of calibrated so that each bust could be examined and measured and filmed in exactly the right way so that the images could line up. So he spent a lot of time lighting and measuring. And he was fascinating to talk to and passionate about his work, and has done so many wonderful things with this technology, especially using museum collections. Some of what he does, and he was showing me when I first met him, was work that he does with collections that are too fragile to be actually handled. He can make a perfect replica of these collections or these objects so that it can be handled and it can be examined in person. So here he is taking some measurements of the intact John Brown. And so this sort of net was projected onto them for the whole sequence of sort of getting the pictures and the 3D scanning, which of course happened all the way around each side of the busts. Took this picture of the way it looked on his camera, or from his camera on his laptop, because it showed the parts where it hadn't filled it in yet. This is a little bit like the kind of 3D scanning that you can do, or 3D photography that you can do of a house, or that you see when you're looking at houses online and you can go into the rooms, but you can only go into the rooms if somebody has gotten the picture that captures the room. So in this case, you can see how there are parts of the picture that he has, but there are also some parts that are missing. So he went back and had to keep shooting until he got all of those pieces that fit the whole picture together in a 3D model. Here he is starting on the model with no nose, on the bust with no nose. And the same thing. This is the same view as the other one, but it shows that damaged area. What we also didn't immediately understand was the extent of the damage to the eyebrow. So this eyebrow it's John Brown's right eyebrow was missing a part. So after Sean finished his work, he went back to his studio and he printed in a 3D printer John Brown's missing eyebrow and his missing nose. And what was interesting about it was that he came to the gallery to see the bust. We had the bust set up in the gallery at that time, just because people were coming in to work on it and, to film it. And so he came in and he had this funny looking blue eyebrow and this funny looking blue nose. And he put it on, and it was as if it was at a cellular level. It fit that snugly. He stepped away and it didn't even need any glue. It just was so tightly fit and made. And it was wonderful. And of course, then we could sort of step back and look at, this bust and see kind of the potential for what was to come down the road. So here's a copy, or here's a photograph of the blue eyebrow and the blue nose. And what actually had to happen was that the blue nose and the blue eyebrow had to be cast into plaster so that it would obviously be white. And so this work was done by Skylight Studios, and it was imperfections that had to be taken off of the plaster before it was applied to the bust. And here she is putting it on. And again, it was the same as the blue nose, where it fit so perfectly that it was amazing. The level of precision was impressive. So she's now glued it in place, and tapes it, and then came back, and this was the way it looked. So there's these areas that it's missing a few, like it's like a little bit low, or missing a little bit of material. So this is how it looked after she glued it and before she did all of the finishing work on it. And this is pretty much how John Brown looks now. She sort of rounded out the nose where the two pieces intersected, and was able to blend the whole look together seamlessly. Interestingly, the last thing that she did was she came and she actually put on some very light adhesive, and then put on a layer of translucent makeup, like powder, that has the little sparkles in it, because the plaster looked too flat without it, in comparison to the marble surrounding it. And here it is from the side. It's practically invisible. You can't, unless you're looking for it, you wouldn't know it. And so we put it in, we put the both of them, the two busts. I am intent that the two of them have to stay together. They had such an interesting relationship together in life. And as objects, they've sort of, had an interesting path that they seemed to both also tread together. So I felt strongly that they had to be presented as one unit. So this is currently on view in the Tisch Library at Tufts. It's in the lobby, so anyone can see it. We sort of got a lot of interest from people who were outside of the Tufts community. So it didn't make sense to have it in a building that was only accessible to students or faculty and staff. So these busts are on view 24 hours a day at the Tisch Library. And hang on, I'm gonna go to the next one. I have John Brown looking at you when you walk through the turnstiles to get into the library. I think that it sets a good tone. He's kind of got his eyebrow cocked. And it's just been a wonderful project. It's been the project of a lifetime for me. There's no question that I am, a big fan of John Brown. So I'm happy to come here and talk to people who are interested in it. So thank you all. I guess that's the end of my presentation.
Wonderful. Absolutely wonderful. Wow. I have to say, I'm also a technology geek, so the whole use of the 3D printing and the restoration, wow. And so let's open the floor. I right now I have, and if you were on speaker view, I invite you to come on gallery view and turn your cameras on, and share any questions you might have. Oh, just one thing, Laura, what was the time frame for this? Like, when did your researchers start to give you the notes that there may be a bus missing? When was that happening?
It was the fall of 2015. So it, yeah, I think it was like mid fall. And then we sort of moved on it pretty quickly. By the time the end of that summer, the summer of 2016 happened, the bust had been repaired by then.
Wow.
Yeah, no, it was pretty quick once we realized what it was and realized, you know, sort of this wonderful significance of it and the history of it. And it moved quickly.
That's wild. And I agree with you. The fact that they were found side by side,
Yeah.
Oh yeah, isn't that a riot?
it's amazing.
We have a question in the group chat. What copies were made and where did they end up?
This is actually something that Ellen can speak to probably with more specificity than I can. A couple things that we do know that are interesting, though, is that that there's reference to Mary Stearns going to see the clay bust, as Ellen had mentioned, and then having the marble bust made after that. But also, while Sean from the 3D Printsmith was doing the 3D scanning, he could tell that the bust at the Athenaeum had been actually cast from the bust, from the marble bust that cast had been made. So I wonder if there were actually two molds, one that was first made and that some are that bust, and that the you know, a marble was carved, and that other busts that looked exactly the same were cast from the actual marble. But Ellen has tracked down a lot, and the two of us sort of trade stories when we hear that one has sort of surfaced or come online. So I will let her answer that.
Well, I covered some of this in my introduction. I have a list of copies, but I have not been able to locate all of those copies. There, what about at least a half a dozen copies have been located. The one at the Athenaeum, the one at Tufts, of course. There's one now in Boston that Laura sent me that picture. The one that was given to Booker Washington went down to Tuskegee University, and they painted it brown, or somebody painted it brown. And I read that there was a bust of Brown in Wellington, Ohio. So I contacted them and I said, is this the Brackett statue? And I sent them a picture, and they wrote back and said, yes. But there may be others. The people just don't know what they have. They're in storage the way the Tufts bust was.
Hmm?
I just wanted to add, I was in contact with Laura this summer. Hi, Laura, how are you? I work with a historic preservation architecture firm, and we're helping out a Black women's organization that's sort of like a Black version of the Junior League in Boston. And it turns out that they have had a copy of the bust that was given to them in 1920, I think, by Colonel Thomas Wentworth Higginson, who was one of John Brown's backers. So I wrote Laura this summer because I saw her article about finding the bust in the New York Times, and I asked her if she thought that ours was of any interest, and she wrote back this very funny reply. Not many things surprise me anymore, but this one knocked me out of my chair.
That's awesome.
I have a question. What year was the bust of George Chardon by Morse, George Stearns?
Oh, the George Stearns was carved by a man named Sidney Morse.
Yeah, and what year was that?
Carved, I think it was maybe about 1865 or so. It was a little bit later, I think, but it doesn't have, we don't know the date for sure, the way we've been able to track down the date of the John Brown bust.
Thank you. It's great, very interesting presentation. Thank you.
Any other questions?
I have a question.
Go ahead.
Being an art museum and having access to artists, was any consideration of making the replacement nose out of marble? I was a little surprised to hear it was made out of plaster.
Well, I think there's a couple of factors here. First of all, the thing about making it out of plaster was that we could get the most faithful representation of it, that we could be as close to what the artist had originally intended without having another artist in the way guessing or trying to make it. The fact that we could do it and know for certain that it was exactly right was important to us. The other thing is about conservation. One of the most important things that they is that conservators want everything that they do to be essentially reversible. And so making it out of marble would also have required a different kind of adhesive and different kinds of materials that may have made it less reversible. And lastly, I can say that that's a tough carve out of marble, that making something of that small size shape, especially the eyebrow, that's a challenging thing to do. And I don't know that anyone would have been able to take that on. That would have been a huge amount of time to work on something that would have had to have been done in a very painstaking way. So this way seemed like the clear option, just so that we would sort of all be able to say, there's no variables, that we got it exactly the way he wanted it to be.
Fascinating. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Eleanor.
Yeah, hi, how are you? Yeah, I have a question. Is there only one marble bust, and the copies, would they have been made by Brackett?
Yeah, there's only one marble, but there are, as Ellen mentioned, a handful of the copies. Ellen and I don't know, I think maybe 7 or 8, maybe total. There was also one that was, we believe, made in bronze that was sent to Haiti, where it was lost seemingly in the earthquake of 2010. So I think that Brackett probably made the molds, but as for the actual process of the casting, I don't know. I would guess that he probably hired someone to do that specifically, but I don't know for sure.
A question in the chat is, why did Victor Hugo end up with a copy?
Oh, that's a great story. So Victor Hugo, at the time that John Brown was, captured, Victor Hugo was living in exile, and he was writing what eventually became Les Mis. So he was sort of writing this book that was the champion of the common man. And he saw John Brown sort of in that light and thought that John Brown sort of represented this idea that the common man is worth something, and that having someone who would fight that ardently for it was important. So when John Brown was condemned to death, Victor Hugo wrote several letters, very moving and passionate letters, basically asking for John Brown to be spared. So obviously he was not. But as a thanks, Mary Stearns sent Victor Hugo a copy of a plaster of the bust. We have not been able to find that one, although we have sent emails to the Victor Hugo people.
I'm also curious in terms of the decision to repair it versus to leave it as you found it. How conflicted was the staff? How difficult was it to arrive at that decision?
It was actually a much it was a pretty hearty discussion. I think that I think that there were factions of people, and I should also say that we're a small staff and we're all very close. But we all in that moment sort of had different, ideas about it and different things that we were sort of coming at it with different experiences. And so, obviously, like I said in the talk, that sometimes objects are deliberately disfigured or damaged, and in many cases that leads to sort of the piece is known that way. So if you think of these wonderful Greek sculptures that have heads missing or parts missing, that they're not necessarily any less beautiful, and so a discussion about this and about sort of the history of the piece is the cutting off of the nose part of the history of the piece. And when we found that it wasn't necessarily sort of cutting off the nose, but so much as it had been knocked over, that made it seem less like a piece of history and more accident. The other thing that we all agreed was that it was so damaged looking that it seemed difficult to display. So we went back and forth about it. And I think the other thing was knowing exactly what the nose looked like. I have to tell you that I think that if it was not for 3D scanning, it would not have been conserved. And taking the guesswork out of it was ultimately the thing that tipped the scales in that favor, was that we could say with absolute certainty, we can make a nose and the nose will be exactly what the artist intended. Because of course, the last thing we wanted to do was actually have what Leonard Carmichael in the letter was suggesting, which was, dear George Sands, could you put a concrete nose onto John Brown? So thank God that they, didn't get the money together for that.
We have another question that's out. I'm sorry, did you have something, Electra?
No, go ahead.
Okay, we have another question out in the chat. How many layers of paint were on the copy at the Athenaeum?
There was a little bit of paint on it. It actually was in better shape than most of the other plasters. So plaster casts have long been used for students, learning how to draw, or as decorations, or sort of they're a lower cost way to have a beautiful object in your house or in your museum. And many times when the plaster started to get a little old and a little bit worn and discolored, they would just put paint on it. This was like not an unusual thing, and it was not regarded as precious and something that you should not slap paint on. So the copy that the bust that's at the Athenaeum did not have that much paint on it. Although what we have seen is, Ellen and I both sort of the other busts that are out there have a little bit more paint on it, especially the one that was painted brown at Tuskegee University. Although they are interested in having that conserved to get the brown paint off of it.
Ellen, a question for you. Was the bust ever on display in Winchester?
Well, I have to say, I don't know. I have the impression that the original was crafted in the Boston studio. But we know from the current residents of the house that there are marble chips all around. So he might actually have done the marble copy in Winchester, and people could have stopped in to his studio there. But back then, there was no Winchester newspaper. There was a Winchester column in the Woburn newspaper. And I've never seen anything in there to say that anything by Brackett was ever exhibited in Winchester, except for the two busts that were donated to the library, which are now lost.
Oh, no.
Oh, yes.
Well,
Busts of Garrison and Phillips. And I suspect that somebody at the library just got tired of having them around, or they needed the space for books, and they just parted with them.
One of the interesting coincidences about the bust and John Brown or Edward Brackett, like I was saying, that it's like sort of like all of these things are everywhere, and I just never opened my eyes to see it. But at the Mount Auburn Cemetery in Cambridge, in 1859, Edward Brackett carved the headstone for Hosea Ballou, who was a Universalist minister and who was the sort of the uncle of the first president of Tufts, also Hosea Ballou. But it was one of those sort of small world sort of things that in 1859 he was doing a Hosea Ballou, and then he was doing John Brown.
A question in the chat is, do you think he did his own carving or made the model and had assistants do the carving?
I think he did his own carving. I think that there's another wonderful piece that neither Ellen or I have referenced here, but it's a sort of marble, like tour de force. The thing that sort of put Edward Brackett on the map is a marble sculpture that is called Shipwrecked Mother and Child. And it's a fascinating piece of work. And it was based on a wreck, a boat that capsized off the shore, I think, of New York. And this young mother washed up on shore with her infant in her arms, both having, died in the experience. And so Edward Brackett, carved this magnificent piece of art, sort of as a thing to kind of show what he could do and get himself on the map. And so I think that he never sort of reached the level of sort of in the profession that he'd have legions of assistants working for him or something like that. I actually think that he probably did it himself. But again, I would defer to Ellen on that, because Ellen has studied Edward Brackett a lot more than I have.
I think he did his own work. He had students, but I don't think he had anyone do his work. And that the Shipwrecked Mother and Child is in the Worcester Art Museum, and they recently, it was not that long after Laura came to the Archival Center to talk about the bust of John Brown, that people from the Worcester Art Museum came to the Archival Center to learn more about the Shipwrecked Mother and Child. It had been in their basement, and they knew what it was, but it was enormously heavy, and they had this challenge to get it up to the first floor, which they have done. You can Google that and see what this sculpture looks like.
Wow. Where was Edward Brackett born?
Vassalboro, Maine.
Oh.
And
Oh.
the family moved a bit and ended up in Cincinnati, which is where he started his career as a sculptor. Then he went to New York and up to Boston.
So, Ellen, a part of what you described was what Brackett needed to do. He represented himself politically when he was going down, doing his journey to meet John Brown. What was sort of the state of Winchester at the time in terms of pro-abolitionist? Where did Winchester fall?
Mixed. Everybody had mixed feelings, but there was a very strong abolitionist movement in Winchester, and you can read about this at Winchester History Online. Just go there, go to the index, and look for Brackett. When John Brown was executed, the church bell tolled. There was a period of public mourning and an event where there were speakers and banners. And there were all sorts of petitions people were signing in favor of the Emancipation Proclamation. But there were other people who were not in favor. Everybody knew that it would affect finances, North and South. When Brackett went down to Virginia and he met with those two men, Hunter and one of them, he didn't say which one. So one of them asked him, said, "Mr. Brackett, are there perhaps people in your hometown who do not like you?" And he said, "Well, something that amounted to probably." And the man showed him a letter from a Democrat in Winchester that said, "Watch out for Brackett. He is an abolitionist and a spy."
Huh.
So there were people who were, I've had to piece together this picture from a lot of different sources, like election results. Winchester was strongly Republican. If you were an abolitionist, you were a Republican. Woburn tended to be less Republican than Winchester. Also, this history goes back into the South Woburn era before Winchester was incorporated. But I was able to find some references to South Woburn being represented at abolitionist meetings.
Wow. That is fascinating. Thank you. We have another question in the chat. Do you know where the marble came from that Brackett used? Obviously, granite is widely available in this area, but what about the marble?
The only thing I recall reading about it is that a cousin helped him get the marble, and the cousin was living in Concord, but where the marble came from, I don't know. Do you know, Laura?
I would guess that it came from Vermont. Some of the best marble quarries in the United States are in Vermont. And a piece, he, at this point, like I said, he would have already done the shipwrecked mother and child, which would have been a massive piece of marble. It was the size of a full-grown woman lying in the sand with a baby, and this, so finding something that would work for John Brown was probably not very challenging. But I do think that wherever it was, I do think that it originated here in New England.
Wonderful. Any other questions? Well, thank you both so much. Ellen, Laura, this was a fascinating tale. I see hands, applauds are going up. That's right. We welcome the reaction. It was fascinating on so many levels. So thank you so much for coming and sharing. And thank you all for joining us this evening on Zoom. We so appreciate it. We love to continue to get your feedback. We're gonna, our next program is on November 17th. It's going to start at 7 o'clock. It's also our annual member meeting, but Nancy Schrock is going to be presenting a recovered painting. Pressy is a local artist, and he did the Winchester Village in 1871. And Nancy has a story to share around this painting and how it was discovered and restored. And we invite you all to join us on that evening. So thanks once again, and I hope everyone enjoys and have a wonderful rest of your evening.
Thank you, everyone.
Everyone, thanks, Electra.
Thanks.